Well, this is the Infrequent Podcast. I don't even know if it qualifies as a podcast for Theophantastique, but from time to time, I like to have authors and scholars and friends and colleagues on to talk about their work. For many years, Theophantastique has been exploring religion and monstrosity in various facets in pop culture. And today I'm privileged to have as a guest, Heather Macumber. Am I pronouncing that last name correctly?
You're close. It's
Uh-oh.
Macumber.
Macumber. Okay. It's a question of where to put the correct accent on the right syllable. So
That's
I
exactly.
messed it up. So for the rest of the conversation, I'll just call you Heather so I don't swerve into that faux pas. Let me read a little bit about your bio. It says Heather teaches courses predominantly in the Old Testament Hebrew Bible. Her research interests, though seemingly eclectic, all involve the intersection of the divine and earthly spheres. She is currently writing a book exploring monsters in John's Apocalypse, which we're going to be talking about today, using the interdisciplinary method of monster theory. And the title of that book that we're going to be talking about today is Recovering the Monstrous in Revelation. And I just love the title, love the subject. Let me read the book description on the website for folks. And of course, in the program notes, we'll have links to your bio and to the book so folks can take a look. This book reads Revelation through the lens of the monster. Using monster theory, Heather approaches the cosmic beings in John's Apocalypse as other and monstrous, regardless of whether they are found in heaven or the abyss, with significant attention paid to the monstrous body and how it causes both unease and wonder. Intertwined with descriptions of cosmic monsters, this book also interrogates the role of John as a maker of horror stories, who casts his opponents as the other and monstrous. Despite the tendency to view John and the heavenly creatures as the heroes of this apocalyptic tale, excuse me, Macumber, right?
That's
Did I
right.
get it? I got it better that time. Aims to recover their own liminal and hybrid characteristics that mark them as monstrous. So that is a fascinating. I've only had the privilege of reading the introduction, but thank you for making that available to me. I enjoyed it very much. Let's begin with what is your professional as well as personal interest in the monstrous and biblical studies? How do those two things come together for you?
Well, I started my PhD and my doctorate work basically working on angels, and it was very, I guess, traditional and just looking at the angelic creatures, especially I was focusing on the angel speaks with the prophet, usually in Zechariah, Daniel, and 1 Enoch. And it was fascinating and great, but I always felt like it was missing something. And when I started proposing papers, I was always off in my own little spot, just talking about angels and not really connecting with anyone about it. And then I wanted to present in the Daniel seminar at SBL one year, and they had a suggestion of like other topics that they would be interested in. And one was monster theory or monster studies. And I didn't know there was anything like that. And so I have always been interested in mythology and especially like fantastic stories. Like I grew up with, the fairy tales, and I suppose that very binary understanding, there's always a hero that always has to slay a monster. So that was kind of my lens of seeing the world, seeing the Bible perhaps. And then when I got into monster studies, I realized that these binaries were not as clear as perhaps I had been led to believe. And so when I realized that monsters can be everywhere, that really opened up the Bible for me in really interesting ways.
Now, this is kind of an aside, although it does relate to your book. I just thought of this as I was listening to that response there. When you were studying angels, did you come to the conclusion, did it dawn on you that even that topic is very sanitized and clean and almost monochromatic? As I look at the biblical material, the angelic have a variety of depictions and forms, including, things like cherubim, this fierce creatures, guarding the divine throne. So has monstrosity even impacted your thinking perhaps in that area?
Yeah, absolutely. As I kept writing about angels, I kept coming into kind of the more challenging aspects of them. And just the fact that we sometimes think of angels just as messengers, and even just the use of the term angel for any of our divine creatures in the Old Testament is really problematic. It doesn't really do justice to them. And we lose sight of the diversity of these divine cosmic beings. And even like the fact that we have angels called destroyers, or like angels of destruction or angels of death. I mean, even the fact that those beings are in the service of God are something that I don't think we take into enough consideration as we're thinking about how angels work. And I totally agree that we sanitize these texts and we try to make angels comfortable for us, like they're the good messengers, but oftentimes they're agents of judgment, agents of destruction. And so, yeah, I would definitely bring into the monstrous the idea of angels, and it comes up in the book as well. I have a whole part on the cherubim, or the living creatures of John, and how monstrous I think they are.
Yeah, one of the criticisms I've gotten over the years for being somebody with religious convictions embedded in tends to be a more conservative religious community. What is it with all this horror stuff and the horror fascination and the assumptions that are baked into that? The Bible doesn't have horrific elements to it. I think a good argument can be made. The Bible does include what we would classify as horror today, and I think your work swerves into some of that. To begin to kind of set the table for folks, you're combining monster theory with biblical studies. For folks who aren't familiar with what monster theory is, can you kind of describe that a little bit, summarize it for folks?
Sure. Monster theory is an academic lens. It's a way, I think, of centering the monsters in the text. J.R. Tolkien, if anyone's interested, has a really good essay on monsters and how he thinks that monsters have been pushed to the side in terms of like when he was doing his studies on Beowulf. And he has this essay where he says we need to like bring the monsters into conversation with the text more. And surprisingly, for a book like Revelation, you would think that monsters would be central in a lot of the discussions. And as I was doing my research, that I really struggled to find a lot of people who are really centering topics of the monstrous. And so monster theory is a lens. There's a Cohen has a 7 thesis of monster theory, if anyone wants to look at that. And his kind of central argument is that we read a culture by the monsters that they produce. And so there's different ways of reading the monster, but it simply can be monsters are a sign of boundary crossing. And so it could be something that indicates a culture's fears or anxieties. It really helps us to know like what a culture considers a monster is usually something that makes them uncomfortable, that scares them, or that they have biases and prejudice against. And so we can really try to understand what a culture is dealing with when we look at their monsters. And so for Israel and for the New Testament communities, we can see a lot of times monsters show up in times of crisis. Oftentimes they represent the empires that Israel or New Testament communities are dealing with. However, in the book, I argue that that's only one side of the story. We also have the monstrous as depicted by kind of the traditionally seen as benevolent divine creatures as well.
Well, it seems but a lot of times what's obvious to one person isn't obvious to another, that quite naturally applies and can provide fascinating perspectives from which to better understand the biblical text on its own terms. And yet you state, you've said here that you just couldn't find much from that perspective. So at what point were you reading the text or maybe studying monster theory and you said, man, there's a lot of point of connection. I really need to add this. And why don't you think more scholars in biblical studies have come to the same conclusion?
Okay, I'll answer the first part.
Okay, yeah, I can give you the second one again if you need to.
Well, so what ended up happening was I started reading, and I don't know how to say her last name, but Deborah Ballantine, her
Okay.
book, The Conflict Myth and Biblical Tradition. She has a chapter, I think it's her conclusion at the very end, where she questions cosmic chaos or chaos in general. And she starts to question, does cosmic chaos equal evil? And she starts to break down a lot of the biases and presuppositions we have about just the idea of chaos versus order, and that chaos is also always associated with the demonic or the evil, versus order is also always associated with the hero or the god that is your god, or the one that you see as the hero of the text. And she goes into the uncanny, and this is where things really started to come clear for me, because she is, along with Timothy Beale in his book Religion and Its Monsters, I think it's called.
Yeah.
He also does this where he questions, is Tiamat really the monster of the uncanny, Or is it Marduk? Or are they both monstrous? Because we have decided kind of ahead of time, or we take the perspective of the writers, the Enuma, and we take their perspective that Marduk is a hero. And therefore, as readers, we don't see the lens anymore. We just jump into the story and assume that Marduk is a hero and that Tiamat is the monster. And therefore, all of our kind of presupposition biases, we take those from something like the Enuma Elish, and then we bring them into the biblical text, because the Enuma Elish and the Babylonian chaos creation, monster hero, all of those things are very tied to the way that we're reading chaos stories in the Old Testament. And so when I started to break down it in the Enuma Elish, then it started to kind of trickle into my readings of Revelation, because I found a lot of the scholars who are reading Revelation are very much tied to these older ideas of chaos versus order.
I want to, a little later, I'll ask you to talk a little bit more about chaos versus order, but you mentioned that there aren't a whole lot of scholars who have made these connections between monster theory and biblical studies. Do you think it's because of just assumptions and old paradigms, and it's just hard for folks to discover new lenses and see that they have applicability?
Yeah, I was definitely finding it more when I was reading Revelation. So this was definitely like when I was looking at Revelation, I was having a hard time seeing that nuance into the argument. And that was helpful for me to bring in monster theory to Revelation. I know that Esther Hamori has a book coming out on monsters in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. And I think she's doing some really similar things where she's looking at God's monstrous army and really arguing, bringing back the monstrous into the divine in the Old Testament. So I know that she's doing that work. I know there's been some stuff recently with one Enoch and the monster. Anathea Portier-Young has done some really good work on that as well. So there's definitely work being done, but when it came to Revelation, I hadn't seen it as much yet.
Well, we're going to unpack a little bit about the book here and some of the concepts to give folks a hint and a taste. So hopefully they'll track it down once it's available. But before we do that, I'd like to be proactive. What would your response be to those, whether scholars or lay people, who might be scandalized at the idea of applying monster theory to the figures in the Bible, that's just a no-go area?
Yeah, I teach a course on monsters in the Bible, and I always start, I guess, with the easy monsters. Like students and others have no problem seeing Leviathan as monstrous. They have no problem seeing Behemoth as monstrous, or any of those kind of characters. But when we start to get closer and closer to the divine throne room, that's where students get a little nervous. And we just define what is a monster first. And I think that's the first step, is for students to realize that monster, I mean, I don't read monster as a moral category. I don't see monster as equaling evil necessarily. I simply read monster as a sign of otherness, of difference, possibly excessiveness, and danger. And to me, that monster can be good or evil. And usually I don't even like those terms, good or evil, right? They can act for your benefit or against your benefit. There's not always a clear-cut answer there. And to me, that aligns very closely with like the Old Testament and how we see even the actions of God on behalf of Israel. Sometimes God is benevolent and is blessing them. And then other times God is calling on someone like Nebuchadnezzar to come and judge them. And so we see those different sides of how the divine works in Israel. And so monster theory, I suppose, is challenging, and yet it opens up the text in really interesting ways, because anyone who's reading scripture will come to passages that make them uncomfortable about, why does God act this way? And even something like the book of Job, where you have God like having monsters as pets, right? Like there's that whole section with Behemoth and Leviathan, and God is just like, look at my beautiful Leviathan, look at his nice scales, he's glorious. I don't think you have to go very far into scripture before you ask these questions. And so my students actually, I think, find monster theory enlightening, because it kind of challenges, like what we talked about before, the sanitization of the text. It's asking students to take all the text seriously, not just the ones that they're used to hearing.
I appreciate that some folks might have in this area. That's why I wanted to put that out there. And not to beat this point to death, but just to get your feedback. It would seem to me that it really shouldn't be that scandalous, in that monstrosity, the myths of monstrosity are a part of all kinds of human cultures, and therefore they were drawing upon various cultural resources, common intellectual ideas, story ideas, and the Hebrews were not immune from that process, and so it's quite natural for them to grab onto that and apply even to their concepts of God. Am I off base here? Or?
No, and I think that, like, I tell my students, like, out of all my courses, like, my monsters course is my most theological one, which surprises them because it's kind of it's a fun course, right, to learn about monsters. But I tell them you're going to be challenged the most theologically, and we get into like Otto's idea of holiness and the idea of the mysterium tremendum and the idea of this awfulness of God, and the fear that one has is in the face of divine. And I feel like that is missing a lot today from people's religious experiences. And so part of the course is to try to reorient students into this idea of like, how would the ancient Israelites have understood the idea of approaching the divine? And it brings a lot of the ideas about like the Ark of the Covenant, for example, and how dangerous it was, or how dangerous it is to go into the Holy of Holies. Like, it makes these texts make so much more sense, because today, like, we have a more like sanitized version of even the divine, of what it means to enter a church. Even like, we don't have that same, I think, concept of fear that perhaps the ancient Israelites would have had.
Yeah, we need a little more Steven Spielberg, Raiders of the Lost Ark treatment in there with melting faces and all of that. So Monster Theory helps bring some of that back. Let's talk a little bit about some of what you explore in the book. And again, I've only seen the introduction, so my questions will be related to that context. And I'm sure your book has far more than that. But you talk about hybridity, the uncanny, and liminality. And then you're using those concepts to explore various monstrous creatures. Can you unpack those concepts for us and how you see those applying?
Sure. So the uncanny was really helpful for me in giving language to the idea of the otherness of all these monsters. And so what I do is I give this example to my students. I kind of set up a chessboard for my students when we look at the book of Revelation. And I ask them to put all the good creatures and all the bad creatures on one side. Like, how would you characterize the monsters of Revelation? And so they very naturally put God and Jesus on one side, along with the cherubim, and any of the other ones, they're pretty sure these are good characters. And on the other side, they put the dragon, the two beasts, like woman Babylon, all of these other characters. And then they have a whole bunch of other beings that they're not sure what to do with. And so people like beings like the four riders of the apocalypse, the hybrid locusts, and even some of the angelic beings who, we're not really sure if they're good or they're bad. And so they end up kind of living in the middle. And it's an interesting exercise because people, I think, would automatically want to place them with the evil characters because of the way they look. And so when we see the locusts, who are like, have these female faces with long hair and really like sharp teeth and mouths that are like terrifying, and tails that sting, a lot of the Revelation scholars will say because of their ugliness, that is an indication of their moral character. And so I really push back against that to say that we can't use like hybridity, even just how something looks, as something to define one's moral character, whether you belong on the side of God or on the side of the dragon. Simply because when we go to the cherubim, they too are monstrous. They have four faces. They are composed of like human and animal. I even talk about maybe they're also human and inanimate, and they're really dangerous beings. They're the ones who actually unleash or are the conduit through which like the divine judgment comes down to earth. And so I really push back against hybridity as being something that automatically would indicate something as evil. And then in terms of liminality, that too is boundary crossing. And so this idea that monsters cross boundaries they should not cross, or that maybe we wouldn't expect them to cross. And so they can cross it in their bodies in terms of hybridity. They can also cross it geographically. And so the thing about John's apocalypse is the lines between heaven and earth and the abyss, they're supposed to be pretty solid. And yet John shows us that they're not as solid, they're more porous. And so we have all sorts of divine creatures crossing back and forth. And so I talk about this idea that liminality shows us there's kind of this, like, there's more to the world than John's readers may know of. And he's really trying to open up that world to them and show them that even though something like the Roman Empire may claim ultimate authority in the world, that there's actually a greater authority. And so for John, that would be like the one on the divine throne, especially in chapters 4 and 5. And so I also use this whole thing not only to talk about the monsters, but to talk about John himself as a liminal and hybrid figure. So someone who's caught between his Jewish identity and his Roman like imperial context. So him as a colonized subject, but then also then how he kind of brings us on to other people in his community like Jezebel. And so I try to bring out this in terms of post-colonialism. So marrying monster theory and post-colonialism, and showing how these texts that John is kind of reinscribing this monstrosity onto other people in his community.
That's very helpful. One of the other things you mentioned this earlier in our conversation is you're questioning some of the scholar assumptions related to order and chaos. Years ago, I was asked to contribute to a small volume on slashers, and I took an interesting perspective in that I argued that Michael Myers might represent kind of a contemporary incarnation of the chaos monster myth, that he's called the Shape. He really is not, at least in the first film, he's not a very human figure, and that you think you killed him, but you haven't. So chaos keeps coming back. And I really think that that idea is still, important to us. But you question the assumed framework of order equals God, good, and natural versus chaos equals demonic, even, and unnatural. What's going on with those categories?
Yeah, so I mean, it seems pretty standard to say God is God of order, who brings order into chaos. And yet, the more I look at the biblical text, the more it seems that God actually brings a lot of chaos into the world. And it really depends if God is fighting on your side or not fighting on your side. So for the Egyptians, when God brings chaos in terms of like the Reed Sea event or through the plagues in Egypt, it looks like chaos to the Egyptians, but would be order in a way. I mean, it brings order perhaps to the Israelites. And so it really comes back to this idea of, is chaos like a measure of evil, or is chaos really just showing what our biases and our predetermined ideas about this being are? And so from the perspective of the Israelites, for sure, it looks like God is a God of order when God fights on their side. But when we shift our lens and we look at it from the Egyptians' perspective, then everything changes. And then God looks rather monstrous. And God would look no different to the Egyptians than any other God in terms of how they're experiencing that judgment.
So that might be perhaps one of the more difficult parts of your book to swallow, is not only looking at these various creatures, but is it appropriate to say in certain contexts that the biblical text is even presenting Yahweh in monstrous fashion? And there's this intimate connection. There's this great line, as you know, in The Bride of Frankenstein, to a new world of gods and monsters. And there's this intimate connection between the two. And we often separate them, particularly in the Judeo-Christian tradition. We want God on the side of good and monsters on the side of the evil and the demonic. But your work kind of challenges that binary and that separation, even when it comes to the divine. Is that correct?
Yes, there's a whole chapter that's devoted to, I think I call it hidden monsters among us or something like that, or hidden in plain sight. And I do look in specifically at the presentation of God and of Jesus in Revelation. And so I try to use the same criteria as I do for all the monsters. I try to kind of set up this set of criteria that I want to look at. And usually it's around hybridity and looking at their body. So how does John present their body as hybrid or as monstrous? And then I look at liminality. How are they presented as breaking boundaries, whether it's time or it's like spatial or anything like that. So when it comes to hybridity in the body, God is presented as both this like as a human and yet also spirit. So there's this idea of this hybridity of that. Who is it? Stephen Moore has a lot of work on the hybridity of God's body in terms of masculinity, and even in terms of like being described with jewels in a way, this hardness of God's body. So there's lots of places where you can even see the physical presentation of God's body as monstrous. So it's not, again, a moral category. I'm looking
Mhm.
really at like, how is the text presenting the body and also the actions? And so for liminality, this idea that like the first and the last, the Alpha and the Omega, like those ideas of like transcending time, that God is not like fixed in one spot, is again an instance of liminality. And then the presentations of Jesus are fascinating. Like even in Revelation chapter 1, you have like Jesus who's presented as both human, but also as angelic, and also as a sword coming out of his mouth. So there's many places, even in like later on when you have the Son of Man on the white horse who's charging, again has a sword coming out of its mouth. And so there's lots of places. And then even the lion and the lamb imagery in chapter 5 of Revelation, I really do push against the fact that when we read Jesus as lamb in Revelation, we forget the lion. And so I argue that we should really be thinking of Jesus as a hybrid lamb, because the lamb that he's presented as looks nothing like a normal lamb. And so in many ways, their bodies are hybrid, and liminally, they're also not bound to any of the rules that we would expect that someone would be. So like monsters, they can move across boundaries, time, spatially, and that they're also dangerous. And that's the big thing. So when you look at where all the judgments come, where all the plagues come from, I think in the church today, in society today, people would say, oh, the dragon is responsible for the horrors of Revelation. And yet, as you read it, John's really clear that the person who's responsible for the judgment sits on the throne in heaven. And I think that's a key thesis of Revelation, because John wants to reorient us, or the reader, to the throne in heaven as like the center of the world, against the idea that Rome is at the center of the world. But I think today we have done our own reorientation, and we see the dragon as the one who is like the author of all the evil.
Which kind of brings me back to a little follow-up on something we talked about earlier. Um, when you do this deeper dive into the text, it from a different theoretical perspective, it can be very unsettling. I read an article on a website that I enjoy that takes deep dives, and they were trying to look at Revelation in light of this current tendency that I'm supportive of in Christian circles to try and find a nonviolent approach to understanding Christianity and the sacred text. And he was critiquing some of the approaches of the book of Revelation. And he came away after his analysis saying, even with a nonviolent lens in place, Jesus does come and bring a lot of judgment and bloodshed and destruction. And I think we have to grapple with that. So as an instructor trying to impart things to your students, how do you help them live with the tension and the discomfort that comes, not because you're introducing something foreign, but a deeper dive can produce things that are unsettling with our assumptions about the way things we've always assumed that they are?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good question. It's not something I have a good answer for.
Yeah.
I do struggle with it because I don't want to just see it as a metaphor necessarily, because I think that it does help us to read where John is at in that moment. And so what I do, like this is where post-colonialism comes in for me, is I like to read John as someone who is traumatized by his colonial situation. And so I read that through his lens of what does it mean to live in a society where you're struggling in terms of like how to, and I'm not buying into the whole like persecution mentality of Revelation, but just the idea of perceived threat or trying to, and I think his threat is really like an intercommunity one. And so dealing with someone like Jezebel, who he portrays as monstrous, and yet I think she was probably a leader in her church. I mean, if it is a she, we don't know if it's like an actual woman or if it represents a group of people. We're not really sure how symbolic Jezebel Thyatira is. We just don't know. But that there is some kind of conflict between the two of them. And so you can really read some of the trauma and the violence in Revelation as this conflict that John is having, perhaps trying to reassert or assert his own authority in these assemblies in Asia Minor. And so I guess I always tell students to be really careful about the violence that is ascribed to Jesus in Revelation, because I'm not sure that it doesn't align well with a lot of the other presentations in the New Testament. However, it does align quite well with Old Testament depictions of the divine warrior. And so I do often read the depictions of Jesus in Revelation as kind of a new iteration of the divine warrior themes that are going on here. And again, they are very much like devoted or like pointed towards the Roman Empire. They're not something we should be using to point towards other human communities,
right.
as they have been.
Yeah, we don't need more sacred text to use for dehumanization and violence. That's for sure. One last question for you: what is your takeaway that you would like to have readers come away? If they could only come away with one main thought, what would that be?
I think to be really aware of your own biases when entering into texts. When someone says, this is how we've always understood it. This is, there's a clear binary here, again, between good and evil or order and chaos, to really start thinking of like, what is my perspective and how is this impacting the way I'm reading the text? And then also questioning scholarship, because as I dug deep into, let's say, some of the commentaries, I really found that this perspective was very clear to most people in terms of, you would never associate God with monster. But also I think for people to come away with the idea that the monster does not have to be something that's evil. The monster is something that is other, that I like to use the word fantastic and even wondrous. And so to associate God and the monster, I don't think has to be a heretical statement. It can be something that is deeply theological in terms of the way we're understanding how God is at work in the world.
Fascinating. Is the book out already?
It is. It came out September 15th, I think.
It came out September 15th. Okay. Fantastic. Well, if I know these academic books can be a little on the expensive side, so if folks can't afford it, I would encourage them to get an interlibrary loan or ask their university library to pick up a copy. That's how I get a lot of my academic books, is through that kind of process. But it certainly is going to be worthy. And folks, you need to, again, check the program notes for the links and the description of the book. And again, it's called Recovering the Monstrous in Revelation by my guest, Heather Macumber, right? There you go. I got the pronunciation right. Well, Heather, thank you so much for coming on and talking about the book. I hope it does well. I hope it causes more folks to apply this concept of monstrosity in biblical studies.
Great. Thanks for having me.